Imagine the scenario. You are stationed abroad in service to your nation, and your homeowners association sells your grandfather's land over unpaid dues amounting to $847. This is precisely what Bethany thought she could accomplish with impunity. The email registered on Tank's phone like the blast from an IED while he was positioned at a forward operating base in Afghanistan. Bethany Cromwell, the HOA board president of Willowbrook Estates, had just executed an unlawful foreclosure on his family's homestead, a 2.3-acre parcel of Texas land that was invaluable to him and Elena. The whirring of the helicopter rotors above could not mask the sound of his world collapsing as he processed that while he was risking his life for freedom overseas, a homefront despot was seizing his inheritance for the cost of a pre-owned vehicle. Bethany assumed that distance equated to helplessness and that deployment signified abandonment. She was on the verge of discovering that certain soldiers never cease their fight. This particular soldier, moreover, hailed from a lineage that had been safeguarding Texas land for 3 generations. Staff Sergeant Marcus "Tank" Rodriguez was not just any soldier. He represented the 3rd generation of his family in the military, a diesel mechanic whose hands possessed a knack for mending anything, and a heart larger than his home state of Texas. At 34, he had come into a cherished inheritance from his deceased grandfather, 2.3 acres in Willowbrook Estates, featuring a 1940s farmhouse, a red barn repurposed into a workshop, and a small pond that mirrored the vast Texas sky. This was more than mere real estate. It was his home, where the creak of the old porch swing still resonated with the memory of his proposal to his wife, Elena, and where the scent of mesquite wood from his grandfather's handmade outdoor kitchen seemed to permeate every message Elena sent him during his deployment. Tank and Elena harbored aspirations as vast as the Texas horizon. Upon his return from Afghanistan, they planned to restore the farmhouse, begin a family, and perhaps grow his diesel repair business in the remodeled barn, where the lowing of cattle from adjacent ranches beyond the subdivision's immaculate walls served as a reminder that an authentic existence thrived beyond the confines of HOA rules. Elena, a primary school teacher with boundless patience for both her students and military deployments, was managing things at home while ticking off the days until his return. But every Eden has its serpent, and Willowbrook Estates had Bethany Cromwell. Bethany, 52, had served as the HOA board president for 6 years, a tenure sufficient to elevate minor power into a masterpiece of control that would stir envy in Napoleon. She commanded a white BMW X5 that shone as brightly as her ambition, resided in the subdivision's grandest home, and was notably married to City Councilman Harold Cromwell, which made her a woman who amassed influence the way others might collect fine art. Real estate was her expertise, control was her obsession, and it appeared that military families were her preferred prey. 3 months into Tank's deployment, Bethany initiated what she likely considered a magnum opus of red tape aggression, beginning with violation notices that would have been comical were they not so venomous. An unapproved exterior paint color for a barn that had been red since the 1940s. Unacceptable vegetation height for native prairie grasses Tank's grandfather had deliberately cultivated for wildlife. Non-compliant architectural elements on an 80-year-old farmhouse that had withstood more storms than Bethany had eaten hot meals. Elena took on extra shifts, quite literally, to settle the escalating fines while Tank navigated IED threats half a planet away. When the violations grew to $200 per day penalties, Elena connected with other military families in the area, only to find an unsettling trend. Bethany had a distinct penchant for targeting deployed soldiers. The sound of high-priced footwear on Tank's hand-laid gravel driveway should have been Elena's initial sign that predators were circling. Unfamiliar individuals roamed their property, taking measurements, photographs, and notes on everything with the chilling precision of a post-mortem examination. During their nightly video conversations, Elena's voice held a waver Tank had never detected before, not even during his deployments to the most hazardous combat zones. Then came Bethany's masterstroke. Tank purportedly owed $847 in special assessments for community beautification. When Elena was unable to provide documentation that had never been dispatched to begin with, Bethany initiated foreclosure with a speed that defied any notion of due process. Through a crackling video link that made Elena's tears appear pixelated, She recounted the sound of strangers moving through their home, their future, their aspirations, while Tank's jaw tightened as he observed his wife's anguish on a laptop screen 8,000 miles away. Bethany, however, had made a single, crucial error in judgment. She believed distance meant powerlessness, deployment meant abandonment, and a soldier's oath was applicable only to foreign adversaries. She was about to find out that some battles follow you home, and Tank Rodriguez never lost a battle that counted. Bethany Cromwell was not one to let matters rest. She sped up the foreclosure schedule with a manic intensity, asserting that Tank's military status offered no protection because he had, by deploying, abandoned the property. This claim was not merely uninformed, it was unlawful. According to the Service Members Civil Relief Act, SCRA, the property of active duty military members cannot be foreclosed upon without a court order, a step Bethany had studiously sidestepped. Elena's hands shook as she contacted the base legal office, the sharp, metallic taste of fear on her tongue. But Tank's JAG lawyers were not prepared to overlook this transgression and promptly filed an emergency motion to nullify the sale, concurrently launching investigations into SCRA violations that would disrupt Bethany's placid existence. In the meantime, Elena had been engaged in investigative efforts worthy of a master sleuth. She spent late nights at the kitchen table, enveloped by the aroma of cold coffee and resolve, and made an explosive discovery. Bethany had been acquiring foreclosed HOA properties via a front corporation named Cromwell Holdings LLC and then reselling them for substantial profits, effectively transforming the HOA into her private real estate conglomerate. When Elena rallied other military spouses in the subdivision, they revealed a trend more alarming than anyone had conceived. 3 other service members had lost their properties during deployments. Bethany repeatedly labeled military families as transients in recorded meetings. Most astoundingly, the HOA had been functioning without the requisite state registration for 2 years. This finding prompted Tank's counteroffensive from 8,000 miles away, as he orchestrated a legal assault that would have made his commanding officers proud. His unit commander, Colonel Patricia Hayes, personally contacted the Texas Attorney General's office, while military legal advocates started to flood local courts with motions, creating a deluge of legal action. Here is a fact many people do not know about HOAs. They are mandated to be registered with the state and must adhere to particular procedures for foreclosure. However, numerous HOAs operate in ambiguous legal territory, depending on homeowners being too overwhelmed or cowed to contest them. It is crucial to always register your military status with your HOA before deploying, as this activates automatic SCRA safeguards that can protect your home. This one simple action might have thwarted Bethany's entire plot, but her hubris had caused her to disregard federal law. Now, that ignorance was poised to become exceedingly costly. Bethany's reaction was characteristically explosive. She lodged counter-complaints with the city, alleging Tank's property was blighted and presented health risks. The sound of her heels clicking forcefully across the marble floors of City Hall became the dreaded soundtrack for Elena. Next, she convinced her husband, Harold, to expedite the condemnation process through his city council influence. If she could not purloin the property via foreclosure, she would have the city appropriate it through eminent domain. But assistance arrived from an unforeseen quarter in the form of Jerry Washington, a retired Army colonel residing 3 streets away who had been discreetly compiling records of HOA infractions for years. He materialized with a file so substantial it could stop a charging bull, packed with proof of Bethany's methodical abuse of authority. The true bombshell dropped when Elena's inquiry uncovered that Bethany's husband, Harold, was indebted for over $340,000 to casinos in Louisiana. This meant the foreclosure plot was not merely about influence. It was a matter of survival. They were literally purloining houses to cover Harold's gambling losses. The scent of desperation was beginning to eclipse Bethany's costly perfume. During flickering video calls that faltered as much as Tank's patience, Elena saw her husband shift from a frustrated soldier into a methodical planner who stated, "She picked the wrong soldier to mess with," his voice imbued with the quiet self-assurance of a man who had survived IEDs and would not be undone by neighborhood power plays. Between patrols, Tank delved into Texas property law with the same fervor he devoted to disarming explosives. His diesel-stained fingers typed legal queries that would soon manifest as Bethany's worst fear. The community began to choose allegiances as military families spoke in hushed tones in grocery store aisles about Bethany's methods, and neighbors who had previously been afraid of HOA violations began to inquire about their own rights. The scent of defiance hung in the Texas atmosphere, blending with the smoke of barbecue and the distant lowing of cattle beyond the subdivision's manufactured borders. Elena could sense a shift in momentum, as what began as one woman's effort to safeguard her deployed husband's property was evolving into something larger, a collective realization across the community of the abuse of power that had been concealed behind immaculate lawns and architectural rules. Tank was returning to a battlefield, but this time, he would not be fighting by himself. And Bethany Cromwell was about to learn that some adversaries fight back with an arsenal she had never faced: federal law, military solidarity, and the overwhelming power of a community that had reached its breaking point. Bethany learned of Tank's counteroffensive when FBI agents started posing casual inquiries to her neighbors about HOA protocols. Her reaction was to escalate her efforts, like a high-stakes player on a losing streak. She bribed City Inspector Pete Kowalski to declare Tank's barn structurally deficient and set a date for its immediate demolition. If she could eliminate the most prominent emblem of his grandfather's legacy, perhaps Tank would abandon the struggle. The stench of malfeasance was as dense as engine smoke when Kowalski appeared with his clipboard and a look of guilt, proclaiming that an 80-year-old barn, which had endured hurricanes, was abruptly a threat to public safety. Elena was not prepared to let them demolish her husband's heritage without a fight. She telephoned Jerry Washington, who showed up 30 minutes later with coffee and a manila folder destined to alter the course of events. Jerry had been probing deeper than mere HOA infractions. He had been examining the Cromwell's finances with the meticulousness of a man who had dedicated 40 years to military intelligence. His findings sent a chill down Elena's spine. Harold Cromwell was not just $340,000 in debt to Louisiana casinos. He had been leveraging city funds to settle his debts, approving emergency road repairs that funneled money directly to shell companies owned by his gambling associates. This revelation led Jerry to reach out to his network of retired military legal professionals, who inundated Tank's JAG team with evidence that transformed a straightforward foreclosure matter into a multi-state federal inquiry. Jerry explained the concept of ultra vires actions, which occur when HOAs go beyond their legal jurisdiction by enforcing regulations not specified in their registered covenants. Elena discovered that the majority of Bethany's cited violations were entirely fabricated. Here is the essential insight. HOAs are only empowered to enforce regulations that are explicitly stated in their registered covenants. Therefore, it is vital to document every violation they allege and insist on seeing the particular bylaw that justifies it. This one strategy had already enabled Jerry to invalidate numerous baseless fines in adjacent subdivisions. Bethany's desperation escalated when she engaged private security to monitor Tank's property and harass Elena. Guards stationed themselves outside the elementary school where Elena was a teacher, their radio communications crackling like bacon on a griddle as they tailed her to the supermarket and the bank. Elena's hands trembled as she marked student papers, her coffee turning cold as she strained to hear the sound of boots on the gravel driveway. But the harassment tactic failed in a magnificent fashion when parents began to question why armed individuals were observing their children's teacher. Local journalist Rebecca Martinez, tipped off by Jerry, started to look into the story for a series on the abuse of military families by HOAs. Abruptly, Bethany's personal vendetta was rapidly entering the public sphere. Rebecca's report went viral on social media, with hashtag #JusticeForTank trending in the local area. Veterans organizations across Texas committed their support, and military families began to share their own HOA horror stories. The taste of victory was beginning to mingle with the persistent dust of legal papers. From Afghanistan, Tank started to study Texas property law during his off-duty periods with the focus of a man orchestrating a military campaign. He unearthed something that made his pulse quicken. Willowbrook Estates had been constructed on land with subsurface mineral rights that had not been correctly conveyed to the developers. This was not just a curious fact, it was potentially explosive. Tank placed a guarded call to his grandfather's former lawyer, the sharp-witted Mr. Pettigrew, now 78, but still possessing a perfect memory of every detail of every contract he had ever drafted. "Mr. Pettigrew, I need you to retrieve some long-dormant records," Tank stated, his voice carrying the gravity of a man who had located his weapon. "It's time to call in some favors." The community was uniting behind Elena as she formed what she dubbed the Willowbrook Veterans Alliance. 18 current and former military families who had been singled out by Bethany's plots and were now prepared to retaliate as a group. The sound of Elena's printer, working ceaselessly, filled the house as she compiled a record of every unlawful act, every falsified signature, and every breach of federal law, compiling a case that would eventually overwhelm Bethany under a mountain of her own malfeasance. Bethany attempted one final, desperate move, filing a lawsuit asserting that Tank's property harbored environmental toxins and had to be appropriated under eminent domain for public safety. But her legal strategies were growing more and more desperate as FBI agents persisted with their inquiry and Harold's gambling debts were made public. The scent of fear was replacing her high-end perfume, and even her high-priced Dallas attorneys were beginning to return her calls with less frequency. Tank's last communication to Elena held the quiet assurance of a soldier who had discovered his opponent's vulnerability. "Baby, she believes she's up against a deployed soldier. But I'm returning home soon, and I'm arriving with the entire force of the U.S. military behind me. Tell Mr. Pettigrew to get those files ready." Bethany Cromwell is about to find out what occurs when you steal from the wrong family. Bethany was starting to feel frantic, and desperation drives people to foolish acts. She persuaded Harold to rush through an emergency city ordinance that declared military-owned property subject to expedited municipal review for community safety, effectively granting the city the authority to confiscate any military family's residence if they considered it necessary. The ordinance was approved at 2 a.m. in a meeting that was not officially announced. With only Harold and 2 of his allies in attendance, the fluorescent lights buzzing like irate wasps over the deserted council chambers. Elena had been tracking city council proceedings like a hawk, and she uncovered something that made her stomach plummet like a malfunctioning elevator. Bethany had falsified Tank's signature on official HOA papers, asserting that he had willingly consented to accelerated foreclosure proceedings while on deployment. The forgery was amateurish. Tank's genuine signature possessed the meticulous precision of a man who had endorsed thousands of military forms, whereas the counterfeit one resembled a child's effort at cursive. Elena captured images of the documents with unsteady hands, the taste of copper in her mouth as she comprehended how profound Bethany's corruption was. This was no longer just an HOA overstepping its bounds. This was federal mail fraud. Tank's JAG team immediately pressed charges, and the FBI launched a comprehensive investigation into Cromwell Holdings LLC, which would unveil a network of financial offenses that crossed 3 states. From Jerry's legal research, Elena learned a crucial fact about quiet title actions, legal proceedings designed to affirm clear ownership of property when conflicts emerge. If you can establish that someone has a legally laid claim to your property, you can not only reclaim it, but also sue for damages related to their fraudulent behavior. It is always wise to store original property deeds in a safe deposit box rather than at home. Documents kept at home can vanish during opportune burglaries or unexplained fires. The community's rally was transforming into a beautiful spectacle, akin to a neighborhood barn raising, but with legal papers instead of wood. Jerry coordinated the Willowbrook Veterans Alliance, comprising 18 current and former military families who had been targeted by Bethany's schemes. They turned Elena's house into a command center, where the sound of her overworked printer mingled with the voices of military spouses exchanging horror stories while constructing an irrefutable case. The aroma of fresh coffee and resolve filled the room as neighbors, who had once been too afraid to challenge the HOA, suddenly discovered their voices and their bravery. Rebecca Martinez's reporting was attracting national coverage. Military advocacy organizations joined Tank's cause, and the hashtag Justice for Tank trended across the country. Veterans groups shared tales of HOA mistreatment, and suddenly, Bethany's small domain was placed under a microscope that exposed all the sordid details she had concealed behind immaculate lawns. The irony was exquisite. Bethany's efforts to suppress one military family had roused a whole neighborhood of fighters who understood how to operate as a cohesive unit. Bethany's ultimate gambit was to file a lawsuit alleging that Tank's property harbored environmental toxins from old agricultural chemicals and had to be seized under eminent domain for public safety. She retained environmental consultants who conveniently discovered trace levels of pesticides that had been used lawfully for decades, then contended that these presented an urgent danger to the community. But her legal strategies were becoming increasingly desperate as FBI agents continued to ask probing questions. Harold's gambling debts were exposed, and even her high-priced Dallas lawyers started returning her calls less often, like opportunistic allies deserting a failing cause. From Afghanistan, Tank conferred with Mr. Pettigrew in conversations that stretched late into the night, examining documents from 1987 that disclosed something remarkable about his grandfather's original land agreement. The old lawyer's voice buzzed with excitement as he detailed mineral rights, original land grants, and something referred to as the homestead provision of 1987 that would soon invert Bethany's reality. Tank's voice held the quiet confidence of a soldier who had found his enemy's weakness. Mr. Pettigrew has been safeguarding some very intriguing secrets for 36 years, and it's time to reveal them. Elena's breaking point arrived when security guards tailed her to the supermarket, observing her as she purchased milk and bread as if she were a felon. She broke down in tears in the cereal aisle, caught between the Cheerios and the cornflakes. The scent of floor polish and the hum of fluorescent lights somehow intensified her misery. An older woman came to her aid. It was Jerry's wife, Martha, a retired nurse who volunteered to help organize the veteran families and their legal papers. Martha possessed the gentle fortitude of someone who had dedicated decades to looking after others, becoming the emotional anchor that held the alliance steady during its most trying times. The taste of victory was starting to blend with Elena's morning coffee, as Tank's final message before the major disclosure held the gravity of a man in full control. "Baby, I've been speaking with some very interesting people here about military protocols for retrieving confiscated assets. Are you aware that the Army has procedures for addressing the theft of service members' property? Tell everyone to prepare. Things are about to become highly eventful back on the home front, and Bethany Cromwell is going to regret ever hearing the name Rodriguez." Mr. Pettigrew's voice came through the international line, crackling with the excitement of a man who had waited 36 years to execute the ideal snare. "Marcus, your grandfather was the most astute man I have ever met, and he left you something that is going to demolish Bethany Cromwell's world." Tank leaned in closer in the dusty communications tent, the keen taste of expectation on his tongue, as the elderly lawyer revealed that his grandfather had never actually transferred the mineral rights to the subdivision developers when he sold the surface land in 1987. The 1987 deed included a clause that conveyed only surface development rights, which signified that Tank held the title to the subsurface mineral rights beneath the whole 847-acre Willowbrook Estates development, encompassing oil, gas, and water rights under every home, every road, and every immaculate lawn in Bethany's little kingdom. His grandfather had been a canny negotiator who suspected the presence of oil and had held on to the mineral rights for the benefit of future generations. But he had never informed the 12-year-old Tank, who was more captivated by baseball than real estate law. Elena's hands shook as she examined the original deed in Mr. Pettigrew's office, the scent of old paper and leather from her grandfather-in-law's files filling the air as the enormity of the revelation settled in. In Texas, mineral rights can be detached from surface rights and traded independently, establishing two separate forms of ownership for the same tract of land. It is essential to always confirm which rights you are actually acquiring when you purchase property. Mineral rights can be valued in the millions and are frequently sold apart from the surface. This provided the reason for Bethany's desperate attempts to obtain properties through foreclosure. She wasn't merely seizing homes. She was maneuvering to profit from something far more substantial. The detail that truly set Elena's pulse racing was a recent geological survey the city had ordered for water management, which had, in fact, detected considerable natural gas deposits beneath the subdivision. Harold had been covertly conferring with officials from Perrin Basin Energy Corporation, attempting to acquire mineral rights so they could lease drilling rights for hydraulic fracturing, a deal estimated to be worth $50 million. The HOA foreclosures were not just about influence or Harold's gambling problems. They were about obtaining properties with mineral rights to sell to energy firms for wealth that would last for generations. Mr. Pettigrew's disclosure landed like a clap of thunder. Your grandfather was safeguarding this land for you, Marcus. He said that one day you would require leverage against individuals who believe money makes them beyond reproach. Tank now held the dominant estate. In Texas law, mineral rights take precedence over surface rights, meaning he could lawfully block any drilling, building, or even significant landscaping across the entire subdivision without his explicit consent. Bethany had, without realizing it, guided Tank to his true legacy by compelling him to investigate property deeds. Her avarice had exposed her own weakness like a poker player revealing their hand. The irony was so flawless it seemed like a stroke of divine intervention. While Bethany was attempting to seize Tank's surface property, she was, in fact, assisting him in discovering that he owned something immeasurably more precious beneath every house in the subdivision. Elena laughed so hard that tears streamed down her face as she grasped that Harold's clandestine meetings with the energy company, all his plotting and corruption, had been focused on acquiring something Tank already possessed. The sound of Mr. Pettigrew's old safe groaning open after many years seemed to resonate with the phantom laughter of Tank's grandfather. Tank's voice carried a newfound assurance during their subsequent video call. His bearing changed entirely, from an aggrieved victim to a commanding tactician. Baby, start recording every single action they've taken against us and our neighbors. We are not just reclaiming our land. We are about to take control of this entire affair. Bethany believed she was stealing from a deployed soldier, but she was actually stealing from the person who determines whether her subdivision can even continue to exist. Elena could almost taste the impending justice as she got ready to see Bethany's empire fall under the pressure of her own avarice. Tank orchestrated Operation Homestead through grainy video calls from Afghanistan, transforming Elena's kitchen table into a command center where coffee rings mingled with legal papers, and the scent of victory began to eclipse the lingering odor of Bethany's corruption. Elena, Jerry, Mr. Pettigrew, and Tank's JAG lawyers constituted an improbable yet formidable alliance, with each member contributing skills that would soon take apart Bethany's empire bit by bit. Jerry elucidated the concept of mineral estate dominance in Texas law. Mineral rights are the dominant estate and have priority over surface rights, which means the individual who owns what is underground has control over what occurs on the surface. If you own mineral rights, you dictate what happens on the surface above them, effectively making Tank the de facto ruler of Willowbrook Estates. Elena's information collection efforts would have earned the admiration of CIA analysts. She surreptitiously filmed all HOA board meetings, recorded Bethany's extravagant purchases, including a new BMW and diamond jewelry that glittered with the luster of illicit funds, and monitored Harold's casino trips with the focus of a private detective. Jerry activated his military connections as if summoning air support, reaching out to retired JAG officers, veteran-owned enterprises, and military legal aid organizations. They formed an informal legal assault force, communicating via encrypted applications and pooling resources as if they were organizing a mission in enemy territory. Mr. Pettigrew educated them on adverse possession laws, explaining how HOAs can forfeit their authority through flawed procedures, essentially undermining themselves through their own ineptitude. Keep meticulous records of all HOA violations, as their errors become your legal leverage that can defeat them in court. The mountain of evidence Elena compiled would have brought tears of joy to a prosecutor's eyes. Falsified signatures that resembled a kindergartner's penmanship, unlawful foreclosure actions that breached federal law, SCRA violations that came with substantial prison sentences, Harold's conflict of interest as both a city councilman and an HOA beneficiary, mail fraud for not properly informing Tank, and mineral rights fraud related to Harold's secret meetings with the energy company. Rebecca Martinez collaborated with national military advocacy groups, elevating Tank's local struggle into a symbol of military families resisting corruption that struck a chord across the nation. The story was featured in Military Family Today magazine and on veterans podcasts, creating a storm of media coverage that would soon engulf Bethany in public examination. Tank's commanding officer sanctioned legal assistance deployment, enabling military lawyers to officially act on his behalf. The base legal office saw this as a pivotal case for service member property rights that could establish a new legal standard for thousands of military families. Tank learned about municipal bond fraud, when cities issue bonds using inflated property valuations to generate funds through misrepresentation. HOA foreclosures that boost property values for city tax purposes can amount to federal offenses, adding another dimension to the criminal allegations that were accumulating like autumn leaves in a Texas gale. The taste of justice was intensifying with every new piece of information, mixing with the ever-present dust from legal papers that blanketed Elena's dining room table like a layer of snow. Martha Washington marshaled the military spouses network with the skill of an experienced campaign organizer, while retired Colonel Hayes provided testimony that carried the authority of decades of military service. Local VFW and American Legion posts offered their support, forging a neighborhood alliance that grew from a collection of individual victims into a formidable force for justice. The hum of Elena's printer, working overtime, became the anthem of their uprising as they generated evidence that would soon overwhelm Bethany's high-priced attorneys. Tank immersed himself in negotiation strategies and legal protocols during his downtime between patrols, tackling the legal confrontation with the same systematic precision he applied to mission planning. In the Army, we call this mission planning, he explained to Elena during one of their crackling video conversations. The same principles are at play. Understand your adversary, gather your resources, coordinate your assault, and carry it out with overwhelming force. The timing strategy they devised was militarily exact, delay revealing their full strategy until Tank's return for the greatest effect, with the right audience at the ideal moment. While they mapped out their legal attack, Bethany continued to commit errors like a ship sailing straight into a storm, submitting more falsified documents, bribing another inspector, and making threats to Elena in the presence of witnesses who were now surreptitiously recording everything. Her desperation was becoming as plain as her culpability, and even her own lawyers were starting to create distance from the foundering vessel of her corruption. The scent of her fear was starting to eclipse her expensive perfume as FBI investigators persisted in asking pointed questions about finances that failed to align. Jerry's garage had been converted into a strategic hub that resembled something out of a spy film, complete with maps of the subdivision, financial diagrams charting the Cromwell's corruption, and communication gear that linked them to military legal experts across the nation. Tank's psychological readiness involved analyzing his adversary's vulnerabilities and leverage points, steeling himself for a showdown that would be waged not with armaments, but with law, truth, and the indomitable strength of a community that had finally resolved to stand up to the bullies who thought wealth and status made them untouchable. Bethany found out that federal investigators were making inquiries when her bank contacted her to say that the FBI had subpoenaed the financial records for Cromwell Holdings LLC. Her reaction was the frantic act of a trapped creature. She tried to wipe out HOA records by asserting that a computer virus had erased all files from 2019 to 2023, but the smell of burning paper wafting from her office window suggested to neighbors a different account of her methods for handling data. Jerry's wife, Martha, was out walking their dog when she saw unusual smoke rising from Bethany's home office. She casually noted to Elena that computer viruses typically do not need matches and lighter fluid to do their work. Elena's social media announcement of Tank's return in 2 weeks circulated with the speed of a wildfire, with the hashtag #WelcomeHomeTank spreading through military family networks and veterans groups across the country. The post featured a photo of Tank in his uniform with the words, "Coming home to reclaim what's ours." Within hours, it had been circulated by thousands of military families who grasped the profound significance behind that straightforward phrase. Bethany's panic was palpable as she observed the community uniting around a soldier she had attempted to ruin. Her flawlessly composed exterior began to splinter like cheap paint in the Texas heat. Bethany's desperate effort to expedite the property's demolition included proposing double-time wages for city workers to level Tank's barn before administrative hurdles could arise. However, the workers were beginning to voice their own pointed questions about the urgency, to raise an 80-year-old building that had withstood every tempest nature had unleashed upon it. The taste of desperation was clear in Bethany's increasingly agitated phone calls to contractors, her voice escalating to pitches that could summon canines from 3 counties away as she sensed her window for action was rapidly shutting. Elena then played her clandestine asset, one that would have earned the admiration of intelligence professionals. She had been recording all of her phone calls with Bethany, permissible under Texas's one-party consent law. These recordings held confessions of fraud, discrimination, and conspiracy that would make a prosecutor overjoyed. The tapes documented Bethany calling military families temporary residents who don't deserve permanent rights, admitting she had altered the dates on violation notices, and boasting of her capacity to eliminate undesirable elements from the subdivision through imaginative readings of HOA regulations. Jerry arranged a welcome home tank event in the subdivision's common area, the very place where HOA board meetings were typically conducted. Over 200 people confirmed their attendance within 48 hours, converting what was meant to be a personal homecoming into a public display of community solidarity. The irony was exquisite. Bethany's campaign to ostracize Tank had resulted in the largest assembly of military families and their allies in the subdivision's history, transforming her own turf into hostile ground where she was heavily outnumbered by individuals who knew how to operate as a coordinated force. Bethany retained a crisis management firm from Dallas and tried to settle with Tank for $500,000 to prevent extended legal battles, a deal that included a non-disclosure agreement which would have stifled the burgeoning movement against HOA corruption. But Tank's reply, conveyed by his JAG lawyers, was both direct and crushing. Mrs. Cromwell can keep her blood money. What we seek is justice, transparency, and her removal from any position of power over military families. The settlement offer made it clear just how much Bethany valued Tank's silence, affirming that her offenses were far more widespread than anyone had previously thought. Tank collaborated with base intelligence officers who instructed him in surveillance detection and evidence preservation methods that would soon lay bare the full extent of Bethany's criminal activities. Military intelligence experts do not only combat foreign adversaries, they are also skilled at documenting domestic corruption with the exactness of a surgical operation. Tank learned to spot patterns in financial data, identify signs of document alteration, and safeguard evidence in ways that could withstand legal scrutiny from the most high-priced lawyers available. Elena discovered racketeering laws. When numerous crimes constitute a pattern of unlawful enterprise, they can activate a federal RICO prosecution. Document everything, because 3 or more connected offenses can elevate individual violations into organized crime, with potential sentences lasting for decades. The sound of Elena's own heartbeat during the secret recordings mingled with the rustle of papers being sorted into categories that would soon overwhelm Bethany under a mountain of her own wrongdoing, while the aroma of brewing justice grew more potent than the coffee that powered their late-night strategy sessions. National news outlets took interest in the story when Good Morning America asked for an interview with Tank upon his return, turning a local HOA conflict into a symbol of military families battling corruption that resonated nationwide. Bethany's final plot involved filing fabricated police reports that accused Elena of harassment and trespassing for documenting HOA meetings. However, the officers who responded were veterans themselves and could spot harassment when they saw it. And it was not coming from the military wife holding a camera. Jerry declared that the Welcome Home event would also serve as a community meeting to discuss neighborhood issues, and Bethany still had no inkling that she was stepping into a meticulously planned trap that would bring her reign of terror to a definitive end. Bethany learned about Tank's mineral rights from her own lawyer's frantic research, and her reaction was the legal version of a nuclear explosion. She tried to get an emergency injunction, arguing that the rights were invalidly transferred and ought to pass to the city through a convoluted application of eminent domain law. Her desperation was so palpable you could slice it with a knife, and even her high-priced Dallas attorneys were starting to hint that she might want to think about an early retirement in a country without an extradition treaty. The fluorescent lights of the courthouse buzzed like angry hornets as Bethany submitted increasingly chaotic motions that sounded like the legal musings of someone who had broken from reality. Tank's homecoming preparations involved teamwork between Elena, Jerry, and the base public affairs office to record his arrival for a military family advocacy documentary that would expose HOA corruption to a national viewership. The irony was flawless. Bethany's efforts to muzzle one soldier had spawned a media event that would cast a spotlight on every dark recess of her criminal operation. Elena could taste the victory in her morning coffee as she saw reporters from 3 different states seeking interviews and camera crews organizing their coverage of what was shaping up to be the most awaited homecoming in Texas military history. Bethany's smear campaign included circulating false stories that Tank had PTSD and was a danger to the community, while lobbying the city council to prohibit the Welcome Home event due to security concerns about a decorated combat veteran coming back to his own neighborhood. The scent of her desperation grew stronger than a landfill in August as she made calls to anyone who would listen, asserting that a soldier who had served his country with distinction was somehow a menace to suburban peace. Her attempt to use the stigma of mental health against veterans backfired spectacularly when military advocacy groups initiated counter-campaigns to expose her discriminatory tactics. Harold Cromwell made a covert effort to purchase Tank's mineral rights through proxies, offering $2 million in cash via offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands, apparently under the delusion that money could still fix problems that had spiraled beyond the reach of a bribe. The offer was accompanied by documents so sloppily put together they bore coffee stains and spelling errors, indicating Harold's gambling habit had escalated to a level where $2 million felt like loose change next to his accumulating debts. Tank's reply was delivered by Mr. Pettigrew with the precision of a legal sniper's shot. Inform Mr. Cromwell that my mineral rights are not available at any cost, but his freedom may be up for discussion. Elena delivered testimony at a city council meeting that was live-streamed to an audience of thousands, playing Bethany's recorded threats while military families packed the room like an occupying force of justice. Her voice was as firm as steel as she played audio clips of Bethany confessing to forging documents, discriminating against military families, and boasting about her power to remove undesirable elements from the subdivision. The taste of justice was sweet on Elena's tongue as she saw city council members shift uncomfortably in their seats, realizing they had been complicit in corruption that was about to blow up in their faces. Tank arranged for military police investigators who were experts in civilian fraud to be present at his homecoming as honored guests who also happened to be specialists in financial crimes and corruption. The military does not forsake its own, and Tank's situation had become a test of whether civil authorities could safeguard service members' rights, or if military justice would have to intervene. The sound of combat boots on courthouse floors was becoming as common as Bethany's clicking heels, but these boots belonged to individuals who had taken an oath to uphold justice against all enemies, both foreign and domestic. Tank learned about Katam lawsuits. When private individuals file suits for the government over fraud involving public money, they can receive up to 30% of the recovered funds as a reward for uncovering corruption. If someone defrauds city, county, or federal programs, you can sue them and get compensated for performing your civic duty. This piece of knowledge meant Tank could possibly receive millions for exposing Harold's use of city funds to pay his gambling debts, transforming his quest for justice into a profitable enterprise that would support legal aid for other military families enduring similar hardships. Over 400 people now intended to be at Tank's homecoming, with local businesses contributing food, decorations, and sound systems, while veterans groups journeyed from all over Texas like an army gathering for a final showdown. The aroma of barbecue smoke was already mingling with the scent of yellow ribbon banners being hung across the subdivision, converting Bethany's immaculate kingdom into a tribute to military service and community unity. Elena's tears of relief during Tank's last phone call before his departure tasted like victory as she understood her husband was returning not as a broken victim, but as a triumphant hero. Bethany's psychological collapse was clear in her 3 a.m. phone calls to Elena, making increasingly desperate threats that Elena recorded with the calm professionalism of someone who knew the game was already lost. The FBI executed warrants on Cromwell Holdings LLC and at City Hall, while Harold's gambling debts became front-page news. Tank's final communication held the weight of a man with all the winning cards. Tomorrow I return to our land, and Bethany Cromwell is about to learn what happens when you mess with a soldier's family and then discover he owns the very ground you stand on. More than 500 people assembled in Willowbrook Estates' community center on a clear Saturday morning that smelled of barbecue smoke and justice. News teams from Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio positioned their cameras, while FBI agents in plain suits blended with neighbors wearing "Welcome Home" tank t-shirts. The community center was adorned with American flags, yellow ribbon banners, and enough red, white, and blue decorations for a 4th of July parade, converting Bethany's cold HOA meeting room into a patriotic tribute that would have brought George Washington to tears. Elena stood near the entrance, her excitement barely contained, her heart pounding like a drum solo as she watched for the convoy that would bring her husband home to take back what was rightfully theirs. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez appeared in his full dress uniform, flanked by his commanding officer, Colonel Hayes, and a JAG legal team that looked capable of prosecuting war crimes before their lunch break. He emerged from a military convoy that featured 2 Humvees and sufficient paperwork to bury Bethany's corruption under a mountain of federal indictments. The crowd burst into applause that could have been heard in Oklahoma, with veterans saluting, children waving flags, and military spouses dabbing at their eyes as Tank moved through the community that had supported his fight for justice. The taste of victory was sweet in the Texas air, mixed with the scent of Elena's joyful tears and the faint sound of Bethany's world collapsing like a house of cards in a storm. Bethany's surprise move came as a desperate final act. She burst into the celebration with private security and her high-priced lawyer, demanding Tank's arrest for trespassing on foreclosed property, while brandishing legal papers that rustled like dry leaves. She shoved her way through the crowd with the frantic energy of a woman who had gambled everything and lost. Her voice rose to a pitch that could break glass as she shrieked about jurisdiction and property rights to people who knew she was both legally and morally bankrupt. The sound of her heels clicking frantically across the community center floor was like a funeral march as she realized the trap she had walked into. Tank calmly approached the podium with Elena at his side, the microphone amplifying his voice to reach a crowd that had gone silent with expectation. "Thank you all for this welcome home," he began, his words carrying the gravity of a man who had served his country only to come back and find thieves on his property. "I have some information to share about Mrs. Cromwell's illegal activities that I believe you will find very compelling." The unveiling of evidence was like an artillery barrage. Elena played the recorded conversations of Bethany confessing to fraud. Mr. Pettigrew showed the original 1987 deed, proving Tank owned the mineral rights under the entire subdivision. Jerry projected photos of Harold's covert meetings with energy company officials, and the JAG lawyer recited the federal charges that would land both Cromwells in prison for years. Bethany's public collapse was a sight to behold. She screamed that Tank was mentally unstable and a danger, demanding that security escort him out of her community, while foam literally appeared at the corners of her mouth. Her expensive suit could not mask the odor of fear and desperation that radiated from her like heat off asphalt, and her voice fractured like shattering glass as she understood that every lie she had ever told was being laid bare in front of cameras that would broadcast her disgrace to the entire nation. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the woman who had tyrannized their neighborhood for years showed herself to be nothing but a common criminal having a very public nervous breakdown. Tank's devastating retort sliced through her hysteria like a knife through butter. "Mrs. Cromwell, this is my community, built on my family's land. I own the mineral rights under your house, your streets, and every blade of grass in this subdivision. You've been trying to steal my inheritance to sell drilling rights to fracking companies for $50 million, but the joke is on you. You can't sell what you don't own." The crowd's response was a thunderous ovation mixed with gasps of astonishment as neighbors grasped the full extent of Bethany's attempted theft, while FBI agents moved in with handcuffs that shone like justice in the morning light. Law enforcement's response was quick and satisfying as FBI agents served warrants for the arrests of both Cromwells. Military police gathered statements from witnesses, and local police escorted Bethany's private security away for impersonating officers. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut was like music to Elena's ears as she watched Bethany being led away, trying to preserve her dignity despite mascara streaming down her face like black tears of defeat. Rebecca Martinez live-streamed Bethany's arrest to thousands of viewers who witnessed justice being served in real time. The clip went viral within minutes as social media erupted with celebrations of military families finally achieving their day in court. In his gracious victory speech, Tank announced that any neighbors who had been swindled by the Cromwells would be compensated from the recovered funds, stating this was never about retaliation but about justice and safeguarding military families from those who would exploit their service. The final revelation was Tank's plan to contribute the revenue from his mineral rights to establish legal aid for military families confronting HOA abuse across the country, turning his personal triumph into a movement that would shield thousands of service members from similar corruption. Bethany was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for mail fraud, forgery, and SCRA violations, while Harold received 7 years for corruption and racketeering. Both were ordered to pay $3.2 million in restitution, which would compensate every family they had swindled over 6 years of systematic theft. The sound of the judge's gavel striking down on their sentences was more welcome than church bells on a Sunday morning. And Elena squeezed Tank's hand as they saw justice served with the precision of a military operation. Harold's gambling debts became someone else's issue as the casinos discovered you cannot collect from federal inmates. Meanwhile, Bethany's real estate license was permanently taken away, and her BMW was sold at auction to cover legal costs. Tank and Elena restored the farmhouse with deep affection, preserving his grandfather's original red barn as a workshop where local children learned about mechanics and carpentry from a man who knew that fixing things demanded patience, accuracy, and a reverence for what came before. The smell of sawdust and motor oil took the place of the stench of corruption as Tank imparted lifelong skills to young people. Elena's victory garden flourished where Bethany's security guards had once parked their vehicles of intimidation. The creak of the old porch swing still echoed with memories, but now it was filled with the sound of children's laughter and the talk of neighbors who had relearned to trust one another. Tank founded the Operation Homestead Foundation with the mineral rights revenue, offering free legal assistance to military families dealing with HOA abuse and assisting 47 families in recovering their stolen properties in the first year alone. The foundation's achievements read like a roster of justice delivered. A Navy family in California reclaimed their home from an illegal foreclosure. An Air Force sergeant in Florida halted baseless fines that violated federal law. And a Marine in North Carolina exposed an HOA president who had been embezzling funds for 5 years. Elena emerged as a champion for military spouse rights, addressing audiences at conferences nationwide, where her story motivated thousands of families to confront corruption and defend their rights. Willowbrook Estates elected a new HOA board made up entirely of veterans and military spouses who did away with punitive fines and concentrated on genuine community enhancement instead of petty authoritarianism. The change was astounding. Violation notices transformed into friendly recommendations. Board meetings featured refreshments and open dialogue, and the community fund was allocated for playgrounds and veteran memorial gardens rather than underwriting the president's lifestyle. Tank utilized his mineral rights as leverage to block fracking in the subdivision, safeguarding water quality and property values for everyone, and demonstrating that environmental stewardship and property rights could coexist. A year later, the subdivision held its inaugural Homestead Festival, a celebration of military families and community spirit. Local businesses sponsored booths where veterans recounted their experiences, and Tank showed diesel engine repair to captivated onlookers. The festival raised funds for military family legal aid and united neighbors who had discovered that challenging bullies build stronger communities than hiding behind locked doors. The taste of barbecue and the sound of live music filled the air where Bethany's corruption had once soured relationships, showing that recovery is possible when good people resolve to cooperate. Tank's case set a legal precedent for military property rights when Congress enacted the Rodriguez Amendment, which fortified SCRA protections for service members, guaranteeing that no other military family would endure the systematic theft that had afflicted them. The amendment mandated that HOAs confirm military status before taking any enforcement measures and established federal sanctions for targeting service members during deployment. Tank testified before Congress with Elena by his side. their story becoming a part of the legal structure that would shield future generations of military families from predatory HOAs. The national effect continued to expand as Tank got calls from military families across the country confronting similar mistreatment, each case contributing to the Foundation's goal of defending those who defend America. "Looks like Operation Homestead is going nationwide," Tank remarked to Elena as they sat on his grandfather's porch swing, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky, while children played in the distance and the American flag fluttered gently in the evening air. Tank's final piece of wisdom encapsulated the heart of their triumph. Sometimes the biggest bullies are just frightened people who never learned the difference between power and strength. Real strength protects others. It doesn't prey on them.